In front of the entire Detroit plant, Lucas Ryan tore Mason Carter's badge in half and called him a broke mechanic who hid behind his daughter to excuse his own incompetence. Mason said nothing, only wiped the grease from his hands and looked at the rescue vehicle waiting to be shipped to the city, then said quietly that the braking system would kill someone. The floor laughed. Security dragged him through the rain in front of the cameras. But the moment the gate slammed shut, Mason dialed a single number. 10 minutes later, Amelia Catherine walked in and gave one order: fire every one of them now. The Detroit plant opened its doors before sunrise, when the sky was still the color of wet concrete and a thin rain drifted sideways under the floodlights. Inside, the assembly line never stopped moving, chains clanking, welders sparking, forklifts weaving between pallets stacked with battery packs bound for the city's new fleet of electric rescue vehicles. The whole building smelled of ozone and hot metal, and every worker on the floor understood that the delivery date was no longer a suggestion. It was a countdown. Mason Carter walked in through the side entrance the way he always did, 10 minutes early, wearing a jacket that had seen better winters, his hands already carrying the faint stain of grease that no amount of soap ever fully lifted. He moved without hurry but without wasted motion either, the walk of a man who had learned long ago that exhaustion was something you carried quietly, not something you announced. He was a single father, and the bills that waited for him at home were the kind that did not care how tired he was: rent, medicine, a little girl's school fees, though none of that showed on his face when he clocked in. Nobody on the management side paid him much attention. He had no office, no title stitched onto a lanyard, no seat at the meetings where decisions about the plant's future were made. He wore coveralls, not a blazer, and in a building where status was measured by the cut of a jacket that made him invisible to the people who mattered, or so they believed. Lucas Ryan crossed the floor like a man who had already won every argument he would ever have. He was the plant director, and he wore that fact the way some men wear cologne, thick and impossible to ignore. He barked at a line supervisor about falling behind schedule, then reminded a cluster of assemblers, loudly enough for the whole bay to hear, that anyone who slowed down the shipment could consider themselves replaceable. On a screen mounted near the executive corridor, Amelia Catherine appeared for an internal briefing, her face composed but her eyes carrying the particular strain of someone who had not slept properly in weeks. She was 33 and already running a company under siege, fielding calls from the board, from city officials, from reporters circling the story of a manufacturer promising to reinvent emergency response vehicles. This shipment, an entire fleet of electric rescue trucks for the city of Detroit, was not just another contract. If it succeeded, the company would become the new standard in the industry. If it failed, thousands of jobs would go with it. Mason was assigned to inspect the first completed vehicle rolling off the final line, a routine task that any senior mechanic could have handled in an afternoon. He climbed into the service bay beneath the truck and began working through the checklist methodically, the way he approached everything, and it was there, under the hum of overhead lights, that he noticed something wrong. The hydraulic pressure readings fluctuated in a pattern that should not have existed. The brake control module answered a fraction slower than the specification allowed, and somewhere in the digital log, an error code had been deleted, not resolved, simply erased. He brought it to Jackson Owen, the lead engineer, who barely glanced at the readout before waving it off as a minor sensor glitch, nothing worth holding up the line for. Mason did not argue. He simply wrote the numbers down in the small notebook he kept in his breast pocket, the same notebook he had carried for years, filled with measurements that no one but him ever seemed to care about. That evening, as the shift wound down and the floor lights dimmed to their overnight setting, Mason stood beside the gleaming rescue vehicle under the work lights and said quietly to David Aaron, the older mechanic who had spent 3 decades on that same floor, that if this truck ever went screaming down a crowded street with someone's life on the line, it was not going to stop in time. Mason stayed behind after his shift ended, alone in the service bay with nothing but a work light and the low hum of the building settling for the night. He wanted to see the brake assembly with his own hands rather than trust a screen, so he pulled the housing apart piece by piece, and what he found made his stomach tighten. A cheaper component had replaced the original part inside the pressure regulation cluster, a substitution that shaved cost and saved time on the production schedule, but under a full load, the emergency braking response would lag by several critical seconds. For an ordinary vehicle, a few seconds might mean a hard stop and a scare. For a rescue truck moving through city streets, a few seconds could mean the difference between saving a life and ending one. Mason pulled the technical files and matched serial numbers, confirming that the regulation cluster listed in the official documentation did not match what was actually sitting inside the truck. David Aaron found him there past midnight and warned him, gently but firmly, to be careful, reminding him that Lucas had already pushed out 2 other employees who had once dared to question the quality of a shipment. Mason nodded but kept working because the warning did not change what he had seen with his own hands. The next morning, he filed an internal report and brought it directly to Jackson Owen, laying out the pressure readings, the temperature spikes, and the delayed response times in plain language. Jackson dismissed it almost before Mason finished speaking, telling him flatly that a line mechanic did not have the background to understand the control algorithms running the braking system. Mason did not raise his voice. He simply pointed to the data again, the rising temperature curve, the pressure drop, the way the automated system was compensating incorrectly for a fault it did not fully register. Jackson's tone shifted, and instead of addressing the numbers, he brought up Mason's attendance record instead, the handful of late clock-ins tied to his daughter's school runs, implying that his personnel file was not exactly clean. That was when Lucas Ryan walked in, catching the tail end of the exchange, and within seconds he had reframed a technical safety concern into a disciplinary matter. He told Mason plainly that if he dared to slow down the handover ceremony, he would be gone before the day was over. Mason held his ground and asked calmly that the vehicle be pulled from the delivery list until the regulation cluster could be properly replaced. Evelyn Madison sat in on the brief meeting that followed and noticed the mismatch between the technical findings and the financial paperwork crossing her desk, but she said nothing, unwilling to be the one who disrupted a contract this large. Lucas ordered the report sealed, insisting that any lingering issues could be addressed quietly after the signing ceremony was complete. Mason left the office and returned to the service bay one more time before the end of the night, the building empty now except for the hum of machines left running on standby. On the screen in front of him, he found the line where the original error code had been manually cleared, a timestamp and a username attached to the deletion, plain as day for anyone willing to look. It was no longer a mistake he was looking at. It was a decision made deliberately by someone who understood exactly what they were hiding, and Mason closed his notebook knowing tomorrow would not be an easy day. By morning, the entire floor had gathered for the final walkthrough ahead of Amelia Catherine's scheduled visit to the plant. The lights overhead burned brighter than usual, as if the building itself had been dressed up for inspection, and every surface had been wiped down until the chrome on the rescue trucks threw back a hard, clean glare. Lucas Ryan chose that moment, in front of the assembled workers, engineers, and security staff, to call Mason out into the middle of the floor. He held Mason's report in one hand and read a few lines aloud in a mocking tone, calling him a broke mechanic who wanted to play hero. The workers around them went quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when it senses someone is about to be humiliated and does not know whether to look away or watch. Mason stood still, his jacket still damp from the drizzle outside, his hands loose at his sides, not defensive, not defiant, simply present. Jackson Owen chimed in beside him, telling the crowd that a man who spent his career tightening bolts and swapping old-fashioned brake pads had no business questioning a modern electric control system. Hunter Connor, the head of plant security, stood near the gate with his arms crossed, his presence alone enough to remind everyone what happened to people who caused trouble. Lucas brought up the fact that Mason had once requested a shift change because of his daughter, twisting it into proof that Mason was not fully committed to his job. Mason did not rise to the bait. He simply asked again that the truck be tested under a real load before it left the building. Lucas ordered a technician to run a simulation instead, one designed to make the truck look flawless, complete with clean graphs and a green light that satisfied no one who understood what those numbers actually meant. Mason pointed out immediately what the simulation left out: no emergency load, no realistic road temperature, no accounting for the delay in the braking response he had already measured with his own hands the night before. A few workers exchanged uneasy glances, the first cracks of doubt spreading through the room like water finding a crack in old concrete. Lucas's patience snapped. He tore Mason's employee badge in half in front of everyone and declared him terminated on the spot, accusing him of causing unrest, delaying production, spreading panic, and defying direct orders from management. Hunter Connor stepped forward and told Mason it was time to leave the building. David Aaron started to move toward them, but Mason gave him a small, deliberate signal to stay back, unwilling to drag anyone else into what was happening. Mason gathered his small toolbox, keeping the notebook full of measurements tucked safely inside his jacket. As security walked him toward the gate, he passed the gleaming rescue truck being prepped for its handover seal. He turned once and spoke clearly toward the security camera mounted above the gate, saying that the vehicle behind him was not safe to be on the road. Lucas laughed loudly enough for the whole floor to hear and told the guards to close the gate behind him. Mason stood outside in the rain, stripped of his job, his badge, and whatever dignity the room had left him with, water running down the back of his collar while the plant windows glowed warm and dry behind him. But for the first time all morning, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone with a calm that unsettled anyone still watching through the gate. A stillness that looked less like defeat and more like a man who had simply been waiting for the right moment to move, patient the way only someone who had already survived worse things could be. Mason did not call a lawyer. He did not call a reporter, and he did not call the police. He dialed a private number saved under two short words, safety lock, a line he had not used in years. An automated voice asked for a technical verification code, and Mason recited a sequence tied to the original prototype braking system, numbers he had never forgotten no matter how long it had been since anyone asked him for them. The line went silent for a few seconds before routing directly to the highest level of the executive office. Amelia Catherine was mid-meeting with the board, preparing to head to the plant herself for what was supposed to be a photograph and a handshake to mark the handover of the contract. Her assistant interrupted with a note that a red protocol emergency call had come through, and the caller identified himself as Mason Carter. Amelia froze for a moment at the name. It had surfaced once before, buried deep in old project files tied to the very first rescue braking prototype the company had ever built. Years earlier, Mason had served as an early test technician on that original safety system, though when the company restructured, his name had quietly slipped down into an appendix nobody bothered to read anymore. Mason did not waste time explaining that he had just been fired. He went straight to what mattered. The current shipment carried a faulty pressure regulator, the inspection report had been altered, and the plant's own security cameras had captured the entire incident. Amelia asked if he was certain. Mason answered that if the truck left the building, people were going to pay for it with their lives. He sent over photographs of the mismatched serial number, the deleted error log, and a short audio clip of Lucas pressuring him into silence, each piece of evidence arriving on Amelia's screen like another stone dropped into a still pond. Amelia stood up in the middle of the meeting without excusing herself. Members of the board urged her to delay, worried about the damage a public scandal could do to the company's reputation just days before the ceremony. Amelia understood, in that instant, exactly what kind of decision this was. She could protect the company's image for a little while longer, or she could protect the people who would eventually be riding inside those trucks. There was no version of leadership where both choices were acceptable at once, and she was not willing to pretend otherwise. She gave the order to turn her convoy around and head straight for the plant, and in the same breath, she authorized an immediate remote lockdown of every vehicle in the shipment that had not yet been handed over to the city. Outside, the rain kept falling over Detroit, indifferent to the fact that somewhere inside a moving car, a decision had just been made that would tear an entire management team apart before the day was over. The gate had barely closed behind Mason when Amelia Catherine's convoy pulled into the lot, tires hissing on the wet pavement, headlights cutting through the gray morning like an announcement that something had already changed. Lucas Ryan straightened his tie the instant he saw the cars, his whole posture shifting into the practiced professionalism he reserved for people above him. Amelia stepped out without a smile and without a handshake, walking straight past him to ask, in front of everyone, where Mason Carter was. Lucas told her Mason had been terminated for causing unrest and failing to fit the company culture. Amelia asked for the gate and floor security footage to be pulled up immediately. Hunter Connor shifted uncomfortably, and Jackson Owen avoided her eyes entirely, suddenly very interested in the tablet in his hands. Amelia had Mason brought back inside, in front of the same crowd that had watched him get thrown out less than an hour earlier. He walked back in, still soaked from the rain, toolbox in hand, carrying no trace of triumph on his face, only the same steady focus he had carried all morning. Lucas tried once more, suggesting that a chief executive should not be taking advice from a mechanic who had just been disciplined for insubordination. Amelia's answer was flat and immediate. A title, she said, did not decide what was true. She asked Mason to explain the defect in 3 minutes or less. He laid it out clearly, without jargon, describing how the faulty pressure regulator caused the emergency brakes to respond late under a full load, how the heat climbed, and how the automated system compensated incorrectly for a fault it never should have had to manage. Amelia turned to Jackson and asked him to respond. He reached for complicated technical language, trying to bury the issue in terms most people in the room would not follow, but Mason calmly pulled up the actual test data from his notebook and let the numbers speak for themselves, plain and undeniable on the small screen he held up for the room to see. Evelyn Madison, standing near the back, went pale as she recognized the altered purchasing figures tied to the component swap, numbers she had seen before and quietly let pass. Amelia asked simply who had approved the replacement part. Nobody answered. Lucas tried to interrupt, insisting the ceremony could not be delayed because the press and city officials were already waiting outside. Amelia looked across the entire management team gathered on the floor and announced that the handover was suspended, effective immediately. Lucas understood, in that moment, that Mason had not just made a phone call to someone with authority. He had triggered an investigation capable of ending everything Lucas had built over the years, brick by brick, favor by favor, and there was no longer a way to talk his way out of it. Amelia immediately ordered the inspection area sealed and demanded a full backup of the technical servers, the security footage, the parts replacement schedule, and every purchasing record tied to the shipment. The floor, usually loud with machinery and shouted instructions, had gone strangely quiet, as though everyone sensed the day had shifted onto a different track entirely. Hunter Connor tried to stall, saying he needed authorization from Lucas before touching any of it. Amelia reminded him calmly and without raising her voice that Lucas no longer had any authority over evidence in an active investigation. Mason suggested a full load test on the internal track before anything else happened. Lucas objected fiercely, warning that a public failure would poison the relationship with the city for years. Amelia agreed to the test but insisted on absolute safety measures, with no one allowed anywhere near the track while it ran. David Aaron was pulled in to help Mason since he remembered exactly how to strip down the older regulation cluster housing, his hands moving with the muscle memory of 30 years, even as his eyes stayed sharp on every bolt. When they opened the technical compartment, Mason noticed the seal had been replaced, not original, not factory standard, a detail so small that anyone else might have missed it entirely. Jackson claimed the night maintenance crew might have made an honest mistake. Mason pointed to the digital signature attached to the change, and it belonged to Jackson's own account. Jackson tried to shift blame onto a low-level technician who had already left the company months earlier. Evelyn Madison pulled the pricing records and found that the original certified component had been quietly dropped from the purchase order, replaced with a far cheaper part from a secondary supplier. The difference in cost had been routed through a vendor that Lucas himself had personally approved. Amelia's expression grew colder with every new detail, though she still refused to draw conclusions before the test was complete. She ordered the truck moved to the track, and the procedure followed exactly as written. The vehicle rolled forward, steady and controlled at first, engine humming smoothly under the weight of the simulated load. Then, as the load increased and the emergency brake engaged, the system responded exactly as Mason had warned it would, late. The truck failed to stop at the required safety marker, continuing forward several extra feet before shuddering to a halt, the sound echoing across the suddenly silent track. The entire floor went silent, workers and executives alike staring at the same stretch of pavement the truck had rolled past. Lucas insisted it was nothing more than a margin of error caused by the test environment. Mason, without raising his voice, laid out the official safety standard and showed precisely how far past the danger threshold the vehicle had traveled, the gap between the number Lucas wanted and the number that was actually true impossible to argue away. Amelia stared at the truck, stopped well past where it should have been, and understood, in that single moment, that if Mason had not made that call, the company might have sent a genuinely dangerous machine straight into the streets of a major American city, carrying passengers who trusted it completely. Lucas could feel the situation slipping away from him, so he shifted tactics and went straight for Mason's character, the oldest move of a cornered man who no longer has facts on his side. He claimed Mason had a grudge over being written up for tardiness, that he was drowning in debt and looking to squeeze money out of the company by manufacturing a crisis out of thin air. Jackson Owen produced a fabricated memo, insisting Mason had once proposed changing the inspection process purely to take credit for himself. Mason did not lose his composure. He simply asked that the file's creation timestamp be checked. Amelia ordered the data team to pull the editing history immediately. Lucas tried a different angle, turning to the crowd of workers and warning that if the contract collapsed, it would be Mason's fault that everyone lost their jobs. A few workers shifted uneasily, doubt creeping back into faces that had started to soften toward Mason only minutes earlier, the fear of losing a paycheck a powerful thing even among people who wanted to believe him. Mason looked at them and said plainly that he did not want anyone to lose their job, but a defective rescue vehicle on the road could cost an innocent person their life, and no paycheck was worth that trade. David Aaron stepped forward and confirmed publicly that Mason had raised the alarm days earlier, long before any of this became a spectacle in front of cameras and city officials. Lucas turned his threats toward David, but Amelia cut him off before he could finish the sentence. Hunter Connor received word that someone was attempting to erase footage from the security server. Amelia immediately ordered Lucas and Jackson's system credentials locked. Jackson's confidence cracked visibly, fear replacing the arrogance he had worn all morning. Evelyn Madison finally admitted she had noticed the unusual spending months earlier but had stayed quiet after Lucas pressured her, framing it as a cost-saving directive that came from above, one she now understood she should have questioned much sooner. Amelia told her plainly that no directive from anyone justified trading away passenger safety, and that silence in the face of danger was its own kind of failure. Lucas made one last attempt, claiming that Mason was not a licensed engineer and that none of his analysis carried any real weight in a legal or technical sense. The floor fell silent again, the kind of silence that settles when everyone senses a final card is about to be played. Mason did not argue the point. Instead, he reached into his toolbox and pulled out an old, worn copy of an original testing document from years earlier, its edges soft from age and handling. Buried in the paperwork was a technical signature, Mason Carter's own name, attached to work on the earliest version of the braking safety protocol that had shaped everything the company built afterward. Amelia recognized immediately that this was the missing original file, absent from the company's current archive, a piece of history someone had allowed to slip through the cracks of a corporate reorganization. She realized in that instant that Mason was not simply a mechanic who happened to notice a flaw. He had once helped build the very safety protocol that Lucas was now quietly dismantling for the sake of a deadline, and the irony of that was not lost on anyone still standing on the floor. Amelia ordered the archive team to pull the full legacy file on the rescue braking project, a request that sent two analysts scrambling through servers that had not been touched in years, cabinets of old records nobody had thought worth digitizing properly. The documents confirmed that Mason had once served as a key test technician during the earliest prototype phase of the braking system, work that had never made it into any modern company profile or promotional history. He never carried a grand title because when the company restructured years earlier, the new management team quietly folded his name into a support staff category, filed away and forgotten by everyone except the system itself. But within the original safety framework, Mason still held clearance to trigger an emergency stop protocol if he identified a risk capable of costing someone their life. That clearance was the exact reason his call had gone straight to the level of the chief executive without being screened or redirected. Lucas Ryan had never known any of this, since he had always viewed Mason as nothing more than an easy target on the floor. Jackson Owen knew part of the story but had deliberately buried it, unwilling to admit that he had dismissed a warning from someone who understood the system better than he did, someone whose name he had once seen in a file and quietly chosen to forget. Amelia asked Mason directly why he had never mentioned that he held special technical authority. Mason answered simply that he had not wanted to use his past to claim special treatment. He only wanted the truck to be safe, nothing more, nothing less. That answer shifted something in the room, visible on the faces of workers who had spent the morning watching him get humiliated and were now watching him refuse the easy path of vengeance. Evelyn Madison provided one more piece of evidence, showing that Lucas had pressured the finance department into switching to a cheaper supplier specifically to generate an internal bonus pool tied to cost savings, money that had quietly padded a handful of executive accounts. Amelia understood now that this was not one isolated mistake but a chain of failures stacked one on top of another: purchasing fraud, falsified inspection records, concealment of a known defect, and retaliation against the one person who tried to stop it. Lucas, sensing the ground shifting beneath him, tried a final threat, insisting Amelia would never dare fire an entire team while the contract hung in the balance and reporters waited just beyond the gate. Amelia's response was calm and final. "Contracts," she said, could be renegotiated, rewritten, signed again another day. A human life, once lost, could not be given back under any circumstance, and no clause in any agreement was worth pretending otherwise. Mason was asked to stay on the floor, no longer as a man who had just been fired that same morning, but as the one person in the building who understood the system well enough to save the project from collapsing entirely. Amelia decided that Mason would lead the process of re-inspecting and repairing the sample vehicle himself, a decision that visibly startled everyone still standing near the executive corridor. Lucas objected loudly, insisting that someone who had just been fired should not be allowed anywhere near company property. Amelia announced in front of the entire floor that Mason's termination was suspended pending review, given clear signs of retaliation against a whistleblower who had only ever tried to keep people safe. Mason did not celebrate the reversal. He simply asked the technical team to pull the correct certified component from the reserve parts inventory. Jackson Owen insisted the reserve stock no longer carried the original part. David Aaron remembered otherwise, recalling a single original brake cluster still sitting in the sample storage room from years earlier. Mason and David worked together, removing the faulty regulator and installing the certified unit in its place, hands moving quickly but carefully under the pressure of a ticking clock, sweat mixing with the last traces of rain still drying on their collars. Outside, city representatives and members of the press had already begun arriving for what was supposed to be a triumphant handover ceremony, umbrellas folding as they stepped under the entrance canopy. Amelia bought time by announcing an additional round of safety inspections to the waiting crowd, her voice steady even as everything inside the building teetered on the edge of collapse. Meanwhile, Lucas quietly messaged Hunter Connor, instructing him to open a side gate so another, unverified truck could be moved out to preserve some version of the ceremony. Hunter hesitated but ultimately complied, unwilling to defy Lucas outright even with everything falling apart around him. Mason noticed the indicator light on the side gate flicker on from across the floor. He realized immediately what Lucas intended, to send an untested vehicle out onto public streets rather than admit defeat. Mason left the final assembly work unfinished and ran toward the emergency control panel. He triggered a full plant lockdown, disabling every vehicle in the shipment at once, including the one Lucas was trying to move. Lucas lunged toward the control panel, trying to override the lockdown himself, his composure finally cracking under the weight of everything closing in around him. Mason blocked him, not with any dramatic show of force, but with the practical strength of a man who had spent years working with his hands, holding Lucas's arms steady and guiding him firmly away from the panel without a single wasted motion. Amelia watched the entire exchange, watched Lucas attempt to send a defective vehicle out the gate in plain view of everyone present, city officials included. Whatever doubt might have remained about Lucas's guilt evaporated in that instant, the last flicker of sympathy anyone on the floor might have held for him gone completely. Mason returned to finish the repair on the sample vehicle, preparing it for the decisive test that would take place in front of the chief executive, the assembled workers, and the city's own representatives. The sample truck was wheeled back onto the test track for a second run. The crowd of officials and workers gathered now at a respectful distance behind the safety line. Mason stood near the control station, Amelia beside the city's representatives, while Lucas was held back under the watch of a newly assigned senior security officer who answered only to Amelia. The second test began with real load, real speed, real operating temperature, none of the shortcuts that had shaped the earlier simulation Lucas had tried to pass off as proof. The truck accelerated toward the emergency braking marker. This time the system responded exactly on point, no delay, no shudder, no overshoot past the safety line. The floor erupted in relief. Though Mason only let out a quiet breath, the reaction of a man who had just watched an accident get avoided before it ever had the chance to happen. Amelia asked for the two test results to be posted side by side for everyone to see, the gap between them impossible to explain away with any excuse Lucas still had left. The numbers confirmed without question that Mason had been right from the very beginning. Evelyn Madison forwarded every piece of financial evidence directly to the legal department, her hands steady now that the truth was finally out in the open. Jackson Owen broke down and admitted he had signed off on falsified inspection reports because Lucas had promised him a share of the cost-saving bonus, the words tumbling out of him like a weight finally set down. Hunter Connor confessed that Lucas had ordered him to erase the security footage and physically remove Mason from the property. Lucas still tried to threaten Amelia with the contract, warning that acting now would embarrass the company in front of the entire city. Amelia looked at Lucas, at Jackson, at Hunter, and at everyone else tied to the cover-up, and gave the order that would define the day. Fire every one of them right now. The words carried through the whole floor, landing exactly the way the opening moment of this story had promised they would. But Amelia made clear she was not punishing the innocent. She stated firmly that every mechanic, technician, and line worker who had been pressured into silence would be protected, not blamed. Lucas was escorted out through the very same gate he had once ordered Mason pushed through, except this time it was his own feet carrying him toward it, stripped of every excuse he had used all morning, the rain outside finally tapering off into a thin gray drizzle. Mason remained standing on the floor, his jacket still damp, but the way people looked at him now had shifted entirely, from dismissal to something closer to respect, the kind that does not need to be spoken aloud to be felt. In the hours that followed, Amelia faced the city representatives and the gathered press directly rather than hiding behind a prepared statement. She told them plainly that the company had discovered a safety defect before delivery and had voluntarily halted the handover to inspect the entire shipment, choosing honesty over the appearance of a flawless launch. The city's lead representative was furious at first, unwilling to hear excuses after months of promises about the new fleet. Mason was invited to explain the situation in his own words, plain and unpolished, without any attempt to make himself sound more impressive than he was. He said simply that a rescue vehicle was supposed to arrive to save someone's life, not become another danger on the road. The honesty in his voice did something that no polished corporate statement could have managed, and the city representative agreed to extend the inspection timeline rather than cancel the contract outright. Amelia turned to Mason afterward and offered him his job back, though not the same position he had held that morning. She asked him to lead a newly created department responsible for field safety inspection across the entire vehicle line. Mason did not accept immediately. He told her, in front of the remaining staff, that he would only take the role if every other mechanic on the floor was protected from retaliation, and if the company built a real internal process for reporting safety concerns, one that could not be buried by a single manager's ego. Amelia agreed without hesitation, right there in front of everyone still standing on the floor. David Aaron was brought on to help build a training program for younger mechanics coming up through the plant, passing along the kind of hands-on knowledge that no manual ever fully captured. Evelyn Madison took responsibility publicly for staying silent when she first noticed the irregular figures, accepting a temporary demotion while the internal investigation continued. Mason never seemed interested in watching anyone else fall. He wanted the system fixed, not a parade of enemies punished for the sake of it, understanding that a workplace built only on fear of consequences would eventually produce the same failures all over again. At one point during the long afternoon, his phone buzzed with a short message asking if he was on his way home yet. He looked at it for a moment, a tired but genuine smile crossing his face, and typed back a short reply before slipping the phone into his pocket. Amelia noticed the exchange but chose not to ask about it, respecting the boundary between what belonged to the company and what belonged only to him. She simply told him that today he had protected more families than he would ever know, people who would never learn his name or understand how close disaster had come to their own streets. Mason answered that the best mechanic in any shop was the one who made sure the accident never happened at all, not the one who arrived afterward to clean it up. Weeks passed, and the entire shipment went through the new inspection process from start to finish, every regulator checked, every seal verified, every log cross-referenced against the original certified parts list. The first vehicle rolled out for the rebuilt handover ceremony, quieter this time, without the forced spectacle of the earlier attempt, carrying nothing but genuine data and genuine safety behind every closed panel. Mason stood toward the back of the crowd that day, uninterested in standing on any stage, but Amelia called his name out to the entire gathering anyway. She apologized publicly for allowing an honest man to be humiliated in front of his own co-workers, acknowledging that the company had nearly let its worst instincts win. The workers applauded, and David Aaron was the first person to bring his hands together, loud and unashamed. Mason was handed a new employee badge, a new title, and clear authority to halt any part of the production line the moment he identified a genuine safety risk. No questions asked, no committee required to approve his judgment. As the late afternoon lights settled over Detroit, the earlier rain finally clearing, Mason walked out of the plant with the low glow of streetlights reflecting off the wet pavement. His phone rang once more before he reached his car. It was a call from home. He did not mention anything about the day's events, the firings, the apology, or the new title waiting for him. He simply said he would be home soon. Behind him, the gate of the plant stood open, no longer the place that had thrown him out into the rain in disgrace, but the place where he had quietly earned back everything that had been taken from him. In the end, one phone call had not destroyed a factory. It had only destroyed the people who had used that factory to hide the truth, while everyone who had simply been trying to do honest work was left standing, safe, and finally seen for who they really were. If you want to see exactly how one phone call brought down an entire factory, stay until the very end.